Hi guys, your writing coach here, and welcome along to my biggest video yet, your full guide to writing your research methodology. Now, in doing my reading and planning this video, I processed a wide range of online resources, of textbooks, looking at how we write this research methodology chapter. And I was surprised to find no one source with any clear structural guide and examples of text to actually guide us along the writing process of this chapter. And so to give you that clear guide to writing this chapter with both structural and textual examples is really the aim for this video. Now, to get us rolling, I just want to answer some really simple questions about research methodologies. So number one, what is a research methodology? Well, your research methodology chapter is where you explain the methods that you used in your study. Now, as researchers, we're always looking to prove the strength and validity of our study. So we're going to use the explanation of our method as an opportunity to justify all the choices that we've made along that journey. Whatever method you're using in your study, we're using this research methodology chapter to explain three simple things. What method have we chosen? Why have we chosen that method? And how exactly are we going to use that method in our study? So how long should your research methodology chapter be? The exact form and structure of your research methodology will be moulded around your study. For example, if you've used qualitative or quantitative data, or if you've collected your data yourself, or are actually analysing pre-existing data. That said, in the majority of dissertation structures, the research methodology is going to make up about a third of the main body of the text. So starter question 3, what tense am I going to write this research methodology in? Very simple, this one. The idea is that when you write that research methodology, you have already completed your study. The research methodology chapter then is a record of the method that you used. For this reason, we write it in the past tense. Right, let's really get down to the meat of this video now and the structured writing guide to your research methodology. Take a look at the chapter outline on the screen now. Now, as previously stated, your particular chapter will be moulded around your study, but these subsection headlines are going to be a really nice way to investigate what we need to put in this chapter and how we're going to write that. So let's get started. Section 1, paragraph 1, your introduction. Now, this paragraph is going to be totally simple, but what I really aim to do with these videos is to get you across that first hump of your writing projects. So I'm going to take you through a really clear example of what we can say on the page to get things started. So this introductory paragraph is going to do two very simple things. Firstly, it's going to tell your reader a brief description of the design of your study. And secondly, it's just going to tell the reader how the remainder of the research methodology chapter is going to be organised. Let's take a look at our example text. Now, as we can see, sentence 1 and 2, we briefly tell the reader the design of our study. And the remainder of the paragraph is a description of how our research methodology chapter is organised. Now, we also have the option in this introduction to restate or rephrase our research objective. And if we wish to do that, that will just be easily inserted into sentence 1. Right, section number 2, your method. So in this research methodology, this section will form a major part of the overall word count. This is where we're going to be explaining the rationale for choosing that method and giving the reader an understanding of how the method was used in our study. So the basic writing aims for this section are to introduce your method, to explain the link between the strengths of the method and the requirements of your study, and to examine the possible weaknesses of the method and talk about how you will tailor the use of that method in your study to limit the effects of those weaknesses. Now, for my example research methodology, I'm going to be talking about using an observational checklist method within a classroom environment. So as the writer, my first task in section section 2 is to introduce the observational method within that field of study. And I might start something like this. As a method of study, the observational checklist has a long history of use within the classroom environment. Great, now I want to provide some evidence or background for that. Marx writes that observational checklists allow the collection of accurate data at a speed that reacts well to the changing classroom environment. Marx follows on to outline 3 further strengths of the observational checklist method within the classroom. Okay, so as you can see, we've jumped straight from introducing the method to outlining the method's strengths within our field. So the following paragraphs are going to be a discussion of the strengths of that method in the field, pulling in further voices to provide evidence and to back up my rationale for choosing that method. Now, just like any piece of critical writing, we have to look at an issue from all sides. So once I've outlined the strengths of the use of my method, I then have to look at the possible weaknesses. So further down section 2, I'm going to start to talk about these possible weaknesses with my method, and I'm going to tell the reader how I've tailored my actual use of that method to limit the effects of these possible weaknesses. Take a look at this example. In the first sentence, a possible weakness with my method is introduced. I then go on to further investigate the weakness using a secondary source. After we have defined the possible problem, we then tell the reader how we are going to tailor our use of the method to solve it. In this example, I use a 3-point plan structure. Following this action plan of how I'm going to tackle the issue in the practice stage of my method, I can then move into talking about the interpretation of the data and how I will limit the danger of this weakness there. Let's have a look at the text. In sentence 1 and 2, I recognise the limits of my 3-point action plan and introduce the idea of tackling it with methods of interpretation. In sentence 3, I use Walters to further explain the possibility of correcting the observer effect in interpretation. Following that, I open up a discussion of the actions I will take to tailor my own method of interpretation. So to review section 2, we're using this section to do 3 things: introducing the method, looking at the strengths of using that method within our field of study, and then examining the possible weaknesses and talking about how we're going to tailor our use of the method to limit the effects of those weaknesses. It's in this way that we're using this section to build up an understanding of our method in the reader's mind, telling them how we used it and giving them lots of proof and rationale that our choice to use this method was the strongest one we could have made. Now, as a possible addition to section 2, if we wish, we can include a discussion of any other possible methods that we considered for our study. This can sit quite happily at the end of section 2 and could read something like this. There were 2 methods that I seriously considered before choosing observational checklists. The first of these was to conduct questionnaires. Questionnaires would have allowed me to... The reason I discounted using questionnaires was due to their weakness in... As you can see, we are simply looking at that alternative method, saying why we did consider it for the study, but ultimately moving towards our reason for picking the method we did pick over that alternative method. There's a few good reasons for including this optional section, one being that you actually did seriously consider using another method for your research. Or perhaps there's a more traditional method that is generally used when performing research in your field, and you want to talk about that traditional method to show that you are aware that that is usually used, and to define your research as a study that actually moved away from that traditional method. Again, by looking at the alternative methods that we could have used for our study, we are simply further defining our own approach and providing proof for our rationale when choosing to go with that method that we actually did go with. So let's move through it. Section 3, your sample, a description of how and why you selected your sample. In this section, we're going to discuss the method we used to select our sample. A simple writing template for this is to start by setting out our goals for our method of selection, and then to go through these goals one by one, saying two things about each of them. Why the goal was important to us, and how we set about achieving it. Let me take you to the text now to show exactly what I mean by this. When selecting my sample, I had three key aims in mind. Firstly, I wanted to get a broad perspective of primary schools across the local area. Secondly, I wanted to focus on using a sample group of schools that I didn't have any prior experience of working with. Thirdly, I wanted to protect the depth of my study by building a relationship with the schools which would allow me flexible access. So we've set out the overall goals for our selection method, and now we just need to move through them one by one, telling the reader why they're important for us and how we set about achieving them. So let's look at this first goal from our example text and show you how I would actually break it down onto the page. In this example, we start by putting forth the importance of our aim by defining the problem that it's looking to overcome. We then pull in another voice to further define and provide evidence for this problem. After reframing the problem in our own words and restating our aim, we have created a strong background of evidence and discussion around the aim, and can segue into stating our method for achieving it. How then you outline your approach to achieving your aim is up to you. Just like in section 2, never be worried about using a bullet point form to show your reader the procedure that you're going to take. Once we've outlined the procedural steps that we're going to take to achieve the goal, we can then look at those procedural points in more detail if we think necessary. In the final paragraphs or paragraph where I'm discussing this aim of accessing a broad range of schools, I can look at the success of my study in achieving that aim. I can look at some limitations that my research had when I was trying to achieve this aim. And finally, I can make some conclusions about what future studies might be able to do to increase their own success when looking at achieving that aim. In the process of looking at the limitations of our research and rating our success in achieving these goals, we are improving the validity of our own voice, showing that we can turn our critical eye on our own work. Once we looked at our first goal in detail, we can then replicate that process, going through each of the goals we set out to achieve and looking at them all in that kind of detail. Alright, we're getting there now guys, section 4, and this is where we're going to look at the tools and instruments that we've used for collection, presentation and analysis in our study. In my example text, I will be describing two key things within this section. Firstly, I'm going to give an overview of my observational checklist, citing the document in the appendix. Secondly, I'm going to be describing the tool that I will use to present and analyse the data in my findings section, in this case scatter charts. So firstly, a description of the makeup of the observational checklist, and what I'm looking for here is a practical description of that document. The major theoretical questions about the design of my observational checklist, like for example how I design the questions so as not to create bias, have already been looked at in the more theoretical analysis of section 2. This can then be a more straightforward description of the document, looking at the practical decisions I've made about structure or how I've laid the questions out to give the observer an easy completion of the document in the classroom. Let's have a quick look at an example of that on the page. For ease of use, I arrange my observational checklist in line with the chronology of the lesson. Questions related to student arrival or engagement with starter exercises are placed at the top and so on. At the bottom I created a section for the overall lesson review questions. I boxed off these sections from the rest, removing them from the chronology of the session, suggesting the ability for the observer to have a period of reflection before answering them. Now the second part of this section is where I'm going to look at the tool I've used to present and allow me to analyse my data. Just like the discussion of our method, we can bring in other voices to explain the strengths of the tool that we're using and why we've chosen to use it. Take a look at this step-by-step process that I've used to create this on the page. Step 1, introduce the tool that you've used. Step 2, tell the reader why you've used this presentation and analysis tool. Step 3, provide backup to your choice by bringing in a secondary voice. Step 4, discuss the specific makeup of your instrument and how you have tailored it to your study. Finally, just like in section 2, we have the possibility of looking at some of the alternative tools or instruments that we could have used. Let's read for a possible approach to looking at these alternative tools or instruments. 2 other methods I contemplated for presenting my distribution data are the histogram and area chart. Both these methods are effective data presentation tools. However, in my specific circumstance, they both had weaknesses over the scatter chart. Although the histogram can be seen to offer great ability to visualize, with my study it showed a major weakness against the scatter chart in the area chart allows the researcher a great range of. However, when dealing with this studies, it again showed a significant weakness against the scatter chart. And again, by looking at alternative options, we are simply demonstrating our awareness of the field and improving the validity of our actual choice. Okay, we've made it, guys. Final section, section 5, your procedure. And the great thing is that this final section is actually the most simple. All we're going to do here is simply give a step-by-step description of how we carried out our research. For some of you researchers, this section is actually optional. For example, if our study is simply applying a new form of analysis to pre-existing data, we might not have actually that many logistical steps to describe. However, for many studies, and especially those where you've collected your own data, it can be useful for the reader for you to lay out step by step exactly how you completed your research. It's often said that the research methodology should explain your method in as simple and clear steps that would allow a naive reader to actually replicate that study if they so wished. So whether you include this step-by-step guide can be decided upon whether you believe you have met that requirement of the research methodology chapter or not. Okay, that is it, guys. 5 section outlines that will lead you through your research methodology chapter. So yes, we have to be aware that all research methodologies will be moulded around their own particular study. However, in these 5 section outlines, we can see very clearly the function of the research methodology and what we need to be communicating as we go through the chapter. So that's it, guys, my most ambitious video tutorial yet. Let me know if you think I achieved my goals that I set out at the beginning. Do give me a like if you like the video. Give me some feedback if you have any feedback as to the content or some different ways of delivery. I don't know, whatever ideas that you have for me, I'm really open to suggestion. So thanks a lot for watching, good luck with your writing, and I'll see you again soon.